Hi everyone, this is Svidler with the roundup video for round 9 of the Berlin Candidates 2018. And once again, a reasonably easy choice for the game of the day. Only one game in that round ended with a decisive result, and this is the game I will pick. It perhaps did not have the biggest influence on the general standings, but it was still a very exciting and interesting game, so let's cover that. And this is the game between Sergei Karjakin, as you can see, playing the white pieces against Vladimir Kramnik, who, since having the absolute dream start and starting with 2.5 out of 3, almost 3.5 out of 4, this bears repeating, has had a horrific following 5 rounds, scoring only 1 point out of his next 5 games, and generally dropping out of contention and not having the best of time of it. And it was going to be an interesting game because Karjakin, to the envy of many people, myself included, has a very, very good score against Kramnik, leading him by +4 before the start of this round. Karjakin himself has not been doing particularly well in this tournament up to this point. He started by losing 2 games reasonably early on, both of them with white, and then he stabilized and won a somewhat surprising game against Wesley So a couple of rounds ago. And both players were on -1 before the start of the round. So let's start looking at moves. Karjakin opened with 1 c4, which is an accepted way by this point of getting the same semi-towers that you can more or less be assured of getting against Kramnik, but via this specific move order, which leaves the knight on g1. If you start instead by playing c4, d4, let's say knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, and d5. After knight c3, Kramnik these days still plays c5, and you get the same types of positions, but the knight is already on f3, which is very relevant, as you will see in a moment. c4, e6, knight c3, d5, d4. This is the move order, which forces black to go knight f6 if he wants to get the semi-tower, cd, knight d5, e4, takes, c5, and here white has a choice. White can play knight f3 and transpose to the same positions, or he can play rook b1, which is a move aimed at stopping the bishop from arriving on before with check, and making it harder for black to simplify straight out of the opening. This move has been played a number of times against Kramnik, and he actually showed some very important ideas in what is the main line after rook b1, which is bishop e7, knight f3, castles. And here most people would go bishop c4, and Kramnik, as is very usual for him in this opening, has shown that he has very deep ideas against bishop c4, and he seemed very untroubled after that move. To our great surprise today, in this position, Sergei Karjakin came up with this stunning new idea of playing h4 in yet another position where it doesn't appear to be natural at all. You would like to finish developing your pieces, but instead of this, white starts immediate play on the king side, trying to scare black into some kind of indiscretion. The idea is, of course, to play h5. Black normally doesn't like to allow the pawn all the way to h6, and then perhaps even rook h3, g3, as you can see with the arrows here. In some positions that could be a plan. For instance, if black plays b6, you can play h5, h6, rook h3, and this already gives white a very significant initiative on the king side. Therefore, cd4, cd4, knight c6 is very, very natural. Once again, re-establishing the idea of bishop b4 check, but mainly just developing pieces. White continues with h5, and Kramnik's decision in this position, whilst not really ruining his game by any means, still betrays an impatience to start a tactical, sharp battle as early as possible. Normally, I think Vladimir would play h6 here, and white has a choice. White can continue in the same fashion as I described in some other variations by playing rook h3, but then black can play f5, and this compared to the game, and in the game after h5, Kramnik did play f5. This version of the same position is a huge improvement for black, because h6 is a useful move, whereas the rook is a bit too early on h3, and the inclusion of these two moves makes black's life a lot easier. In view of all that, I have a feeling that after h6, white probably would have played something like bishop b5, after which black has a choice between, let's say, bishop d7 or a6. These positions are not at all clear, and I'm sure Sergei and his team had some ideas on how to proceed from here onwards. But I think h6 in general was a better choice than the immediate f5. But f5 also looks very logical. However, it is extremely well met by the simple e takes f5. If you recapture with the rook after bishop d3, it's immediately obvious that something has gone wrong for black, because black is behind in development, his king side is very bare, and white will have tremendous initiative for the rest of the game. Because of that, and also because of just how unattractive this position is, black's reply after e5 is almost forced. He goes queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen takes f5. And my original impression of this position was that black has very, very nice counterplay. There is a very simple but seemingly very effective threat of knight takes d2 because of the pressure black has along the f-file. But after bishop c3, a move that stabilizes the pawn on d4 and also creates the idea of playing bishop d3, attacking the queen on f5, and then the king, I think, will feel quite safe on f1. White generally is not in any hurry to castle kingside here. This position already is very critical for black, and black needs to take a very important decision, which I think is difficult to find in a practical game. Playing something slow like b6, bishop d3, queen g4, and king f1 is possible. Black is not lost by any means in a position like this, but it is still preferable for white. White retains a decent amount of pressure after something like rook g3, queen f4, and king g1. And these types of positions, white always is somewhat better, although you could make an argument for this being stronger than the move Kramnik made in the game. But objectively, the best line in this position for black, at least after the limited amount of analysis, admittedly, that I've done preparing this video, would have been queen e4 check, bishop b2, and now the move b7, b5, which I think objectively is not at all easy to find when you see this position for the first time. We certainly did not find it when we were doing the live commentary with Jan. The point of this move is that black wants to play b5, b4, followed by bishop c8, a6, trying to trade off some pieces and trying to basically develop as early as possible on the queen side, whilst also stopping white from making some of the more natural moves he would like to make. Queen d3 is a possible reply, but black already feels a lot more comfortable in a position like this because the queens have come off, and driving the pawn all the way up to b4 is generally quite useful because it will be an asset in endgames. If white goes h6, black is in time to go b4 and bishop a6, and once again threatening the mass exchanges on e2 makes it a lot harder for white to develop any kind of an initiative on the king side, and this leads to unclear positions. The best move probably is castles, after which black plays b4, and after both bishop b2 here or bishop d3, you get very sharp positions. Bishop d3 is a pawn sacrifice, black should play queen d5, bishop b2, queen takes h5, but after rook e1, generally white's light pieces are a lot more active in this position than black light pieces, and white has certain and indisputable compensation for the pawn, but black should probably survive this. And the other idea is to play bishop b2 followed by h7, h5, h6, to which black probably replies bishop b7, and if h6, it's important to stop d4, d5, which is why I quite like this somewhat weird looking move queen d5. Locking the bishop on b2, it's the main idea of this move is we're sidestepping some attacks on this queen later in the game, but mainly we're trying to, as hard as possible, to keep the bishop on b2 contained. And after something like hg7, rook f7, the position becomes very, very unclear. But as I said, queen e4 is a move you obviously consider, but it only makes sense really in connection with this move b5, which is very, very difficult to even spot or correctly assess in a live tournament setting. Kramnik played h6, which looks logical, but is just not fast enough basically for this type of position. Even b6 is, as mentioned, probably a faster and a more sensible move here. And after bishop d3, queen g4, and king f1, black is already in significant trouble. You no longer have time to play b6, rook h3, and bishop b7. You can still play bishop f6 here, I suppose, but bishop b7 just straight up loses to d5, e5, rook g3. And if you start with bishop f6, after rook h3, let's say you can try going knight e7, hoping to land on the d5 square, but bishop b4 is extremely strong here, making it very, very difficult for black to achieve any kind of harmony for his pieces, and white has a significant advantage. Vladimir played e5, which is a very natural idea in these types of positions. During the live show, I was also making an argument that maybe e5 is interesting here, but it's very difficult to make this work, because white always has a very strong play against it. And in particular, in the game, this would have been a good idea if not for the simple fact that d4, d5 is almost winning objectively. Black just doesn't have a good reply. It's not entirely clear if Kramnik missed something concrete or if he just felt that no matter what happens in this position, e5 represents his best practical choice now that he has found himself in this rather unfortunate situation. But white has a tremendous advantage here. e4 is more or less forced. Something like knight d4 just loses to knight takes e5, and white emerges with an extra pawn but a better position, as they used to say in my childhood. e4, d takes c3, e takes f3. There is this quirky move b5 in this position, trying to stop c takes b7, also trying to stop the bishop sidestepping the fork and remaining keeping the fork in place, but rook h3 just immediately refutes it. There are other strong moves as well, but rook h3 wins more or less on the spot. So ef3, gf3, and this is where Vladimir Kramnik had to take a decision, and I think his decision in practical terms, we were somewhat critical of it during the live show, but I think it's the correct move under the circumstances. Black probably, in terms of pure mathematics, has a better chance against best play to make a draw in this position. But after takes, and king e2, which is something that Karjakin would certainly have found and played, black is in a lot of trouble. Bishop g4 is more or less losing, because after rook g1, rook g3, king d2, and let's say bishop g5, king c2, black doesn't even have a good way of giving up this exchange. And after rook g1, c takes b7 is a threat, and bishop f3 just loses to c7. And there is no way for black, the way his pieces are positioned, to stop the bishops from coming to e5 and f5. And this pawn basically will cost black at least a piece. And if you go rook takes d3, white takes, you go check, king e2, b takes c6. Obviously bishop takes b1 would have been a good move if not for the fact that cb7 wins on the spot. bc, rook b7, rook e8, and king f3. And by making a series of only moves, black can avoid losing the g7 pawn here straight away, but he will still have to trade a pair of rooks, and I can show you the possible line here. Bishop e6, rook g1, bishop d5 check, king e2. White is not afraid of any discovered checks, because he will be able to protect the bishop on c3 after, let's say, bishop f6, king d2, and nothing else can be threatened. So bishop g5 check, king f1, bishop c4 check, king g2, and finally black has to defend the pawn on e7. But against as good a technician as Karjakin is, you're basically never saving this endgame. It's just not a workable proposition to hold this. Whereas after rook takes f3, white has an immediate victory here if he plays precisely, but both lines that win after c takes b7, bishop e2 is what Karjakin played here, and this move objectively probably misses the win, or at least makes it a lot more difficult. But after cb7, bishop b7, white has two ways of winning this position by force, and both of them are difficult, although for different reasons. White can take on b7 with the rook, and if black goes rook takes f2, which is once again, the machine suggests this is the better try, but this actually is completely hopeless even in practical play. King takes f2. Black has to stop the white king from going to e1 and d2. Therefore, the only meaningful check here is bishop h4. And now this forced sequence, the king just runs towards the queen side. White loses the rook in the process, but it doesn't really matter, because once the king reaches a1, white will somehow stabilize, the bishop will go to b1, and then the queen will eventually land on the b1 h7 diagonal, as you can see from the arrows. and black will just get mated. There is no doubt that white will win this position. And this Sergei would have seen and would have played quite comfortably. There can be no question about it. But rook d8, a move that also loses on the spot, that would have been a lot harder to refute. And white wins here with the only sequence of moves, although those moves could be interposed. But basically white needs to see that after rook takes e7, rook d takes d3, queen b3 check, and king f8, the only move that wins in this position is rook e7, e6. And just to see this move and to consider it as an option is extremely difficult. The point of this is that after rook takes e3 and queen b8 check, the rook on e6 gets in the way of the move rook c8, which would otherwise be available to black. So this is basically a very study-like idea, which makes sure that the queen on g4 cannot support black in stopping this check, and after king f7 you get mated from e8. Everything else in this position no longer wins. And as I said, finding rook e6 in a practical game would be a tremendously impressive achievement from Karjakin, in particular if you consider that after rook e6, rook takes f2, you have to play king e1, and you have to be absolutely sure that this calculation works. This is inhuman levels of tactical foresight. And the other thing that wins here is queen b3 check, king h8, queen takes b7, rook a f8, queen takes e7, rook f2, king e1. This is easier to believe in for white because there's really no checks, and queen takes g7 will trade everything off and white will remain with an extra piece. But after the move rook e8, which creates a very strong threat of rook takes f2 followed by bishop c5, and for instance queen takes e7 leads to a draw because the white king can never really cross the e-file because rook takes e7 will be a check. Otherwise this would have won because of back rank issues. But here you can actually find the only winning move in the position because it's rather straightforward. You take on g7 with check, queen takes g7 drops to rook on f3, and king takes g7, you play rook g1, and in this position black would like to play bishop c5 check, but the bishop is pinned. But as I said, making these calculations over the board would have been very, very difficult for Sergei, and it's difficult to blame him for playing bishop e2 because it also looks like it should win. In actual fact, after best play from black, this probably would have led to a technical position which Sergei maybe would have won and maybe not, and which I will show you in a moment. Black has to play rook takes f2, there's really nothing else. King takes, bishop c5 check. If black goes queen f4 check, white objectively has to transpose to the game continuation by playing bishop f3 and king f1. King e1 is possible, but it leads to huge messes, which white doesn't really need. So bishop c5 check played by Kramnik, king f1, queen f4 check, bishop f3. And this is where it went completely off the rails for Vladimir. Black has two obviously attractive moves. One is b takes e6, which is what he played in the game, creating the threat of bishop a6 check, and also finally dealing with the threatening pawn on c6, which would have reached the 7th if you leave it alive. But this move has one refutation, but a very direct one and a very efficient one. The other move, which I'm sure Kramnik considered, was bishop e6. And bishop e6 in a practical game probably would have saved him the game, because as far as I could determine, and once again, maybe I should have done some more clicking, but I stopped when I saw the line, which potentially is winning here for white, because you really never make these moves in a practical game. Probably the strongest move that white has in this position is bishop e1, black goes rook f8, and here white goes rook b3, protecting the bishop on f3. And this is based on the fact that bishop takes b3, queen takes b3 is a check, and black is not in time to take on f3. Black replies by playing queen g4, establishing a very, very strong threat of bishop c4 check. And white just goes king e2, bishop c4 check, and king d2. And the computer seems to indicate that this is winning for white. I did not check very deeply, but my main emotion when I saw this line was the computer is very welcome to suggestions like this, because nobody really plays like that unless he has access to computer evaluations. This is, considering the other options, this is almost impossible for white to settle on this continuation. After bishop e6, I suspect Sergei would have played c takes b7, Finding this line is also not very easy, but I think it's a bit more natural to play c takes b7 than bishop b1. I cannot be sure, but that would be my suspicion. And black has this following sequence of checks, which leads to a very study-like variation, which you also probably only find with white if you're absolutely forced to. If you land in this position, you might find all these moves. Bishop c4 check, king g2, queen g5 check, bishop g4. In fact, you could actually not see something, some of the only moves that you need to find after bishop g4. And in a practical game, it's very possible that white just chooses to play king h3 here, which after check, 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 and check leads to a perpetual. Bishop g4, bishop d5 check, king h3, queen e3 check. And here, basically, the next 6 moves by white, 1, 2, 3, 4, no, 5. The next 5 moves by white are the only moves that don't lose. The position has become so critical. You have to play queen f3 here. Everything else is hopeless. Black takes. And now playing b takes a8 would allow a discovered check. Instead, white plays b7, b8, queen check, takes, takes. Black has to play bishop f8. And now white needs to see, and you need to see it from way in advance, otherwise you would not enter this variation. You need to see that you have this option, takes, takes, and rook f1. But somewhat surprisingly, even this position, after something like king g8, rook takes f3, and queen e4, during the live broadcast, when the computer suggested to us that this variation exists, I showed all this entire sequence to the viewers, and I said, clearly white is winning here because the rook with bishops will always be capable of rounding up and delivering mating threats to the black king. And then when I was preparing the notes for this video, I let the computer run here, and the evaluation of this position with computer assistance seems to be something like 0.7 at depth 45 or something, which means that objectively, against best defense, this may not even be winning for white, somewhat surprisingly. This really surprises me because I think, I'm taught to think that rook and 2 light pieces, in particular rook and 2 bishops against queen, should be hugely favored for the rook. But these days, all of these assumptions are being constantly challenged. So, had Vladimir played bishop e6 on move 23, he could very, very possibly have saved the game. Instead, he played b takes e6. And the only move really that deals with the threats that black has here, in particular with the threat of bishop a6, is the move bishop e1. And the point of that move is that if the king will have to go to g2, and in most cases here, the king will have to go to g2, it's very important to be able to reply to queen g5 check by playing bishop g3. And basically from this moment on, white should be winning quite comfortably because after all, he does have an extra rook and black just doesn't have enough initiative. Kramnik played bishop e6. Already here, Karjakin made a move which still wins, but it complicates his task a little bit. But you can sort of guess what he missed. The most natural move in the position is, of course, unpinning your f3 bishop by playing king g2. But black has queen g5 check, bishop g3, and rook d8, attacking the rook and also threatening a huge check from d2. Unfortunately for black, though, queen takes d8, rook b8, bishop c8, and now bishop g4, queen d5 check, king h2, just wins on the spot. This is resignable for black. I suspect queen takes d8 is exactly what Sergei Karjakin missed, and also I guess he saw that bishop h4 should win as well. Rook f8, king g2, and here Kramnik played king h8, which is not the most resilient move. He should have played rook f5, which more or less forces white to find rook b1, b3, because black generates a very strong threat of rook g5 check, and white needs to get some squares under control to mitigate that threat. In particular, if after you go rook b3, rook g5 check, you take, queen takes, you go king f1, and after bishop c4, it's very, very relevant that white has rook d3 here. Or perhaps after king e1 that black doesn't have checks from, let's say, the e3 square. But I think Sergei would have been likely to find rook b3 because it does look like a very natural connecting move, overprotecting the bishop on f3, covering some checking squares. But it would have been a challenge for him. After king h8, Somewhat surprisingly, Sergei decides not to play bishop g3. Bishop g3 would have won more or less on the spot. The only move that makes really any sense here is queen g5, and now the simple rook e1 more or less concludes the game in white's favor. There's really no attack left for black. Rook f3, bishop f3, rook f3, queen f3, bishop d5 runs into rook e4. After queen f5, creating a threat of queen h3 mate, white just takes on e6, and the attack completely disappears. And if black goes bishop d5, I guess white can even maybe take, not cd of course, rook f2 check, king h3, and after queen f5 check, queen g4. Once again, there are no more checks, and white will quite easily convert his huge material advantage. But the move rook c1, which Sergei has played instead of this, still wins. Black plays rook f5, and once again the same threats are generated. But rook c3 solves them very convincingly. And now it's incredibly difficult for black to even find some kind of a progressive, constructive idea. And he ended up going for a very interesting construction, which looked amusing and looked like it might give white technical issues. But eventually, white manages to coordinate. Rook d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook f3, black gives a check, bishop g3, bishop d6. This kind of a double pin looks extremely awkward. White is completely forced to play rook 1 h3. But unfortunately for black, this is the full extent of the pressure black can put on the white king side. And eventually white will come out of this corner and unpin himself. And he is, after all, a tremendous amount of material up here. Bishop e7 followed, queen e2, bishop e4, queen f2. This is the correct setup. Basically, white wants to go rook h1, rook e1. And if at any point black plays bishop c5, for instance, immediately here, white always has this resource to play rook h4, liquidating into winning endgame. And during the live show, we discussed just how winning this endgame is after something like a6. But a reasonably simple check establishes that after white doesn't need to do this, but white can also start by playing something like a4. And after king h7, we finally play rook h1. Black has to try to stop rook e1 by playing bishop c5. And the following line is more or less forced. Rook h4, black has to take here, black has to take the queen, white takes, you take. And black does manage to trade off seemingly the correct pawn for white. And white will be left with only the a4 pawn, which doesn't generally queen with the dark squared bishop. But the black king is so far away that white just runs towards the a pawn, and black will never actually get to the a8 corner with the king, and white wins quite comfortably here. This would have been at least some kind of a test for Karjakin, but after a5, a4, these positions are really no longer available for black, because in the same endgames, white will just attack the a-pawn with the bishop, collect it, and queen the a-pawn for himself. Which is why black didn't even attempt to get this variation. He played c5, rook h1, bishop f6, rook e1, and this is where you can more or less stop annotating. Once the queen exits the corner and gets re-established on better squares, there's really no more fight left. The best black can achieve in a position like this is finally winning the rook, the f3 rook for the c6 bishop, but he will still be a full rook down with no real chances for salvation. He played c4, queen e2, queen takes h5, queen takes c4, bishop d7. At this point, the players reached move 40. Sergei made, well, more or less any move here wins. Sergei played rook e d3. And having established that the time control has been reached, Vladimir Kramnik resigned. Things continue to go from bad to worse for him. He has now scored 1 out of 6 in rounds 4 to 9. Whereas Karjakin is a very different story. He started really, really poorly and is now on 50%, which is not a great result by any means. But still, if he manages to win a game, or in particular 2 games at some point before the last round, he will be very much in contention once again for the qualification. The general tournament situation remains more or less the same. Fabiano Caruana missed a couple of golden chances to beat Ding Liren, but the game eventually ended in a draw. And going into round 10, which will happen on Thursday, Caruana still holds half a point lead over Shahryam Amidyarov, and they play each other in round 10. So be sure to tune in our show on Thursday, 3 p.m. CET, for our coverage of round 10. I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24. Thank you for watching.